Welcome back to Let's Talk About Mental Health. I'm Nels Kloster. I'm an addiction psychiatrist working in southern Vermont.
My name is Robert Stack. I'm a licensed alcohol and drug counselor. Good evening.
Okay. And just a reminder for folks who want to send in their questions, we have two means. One, we have a Facebook site, facebook.com/letstalkvt, or our email is questions@letstalkvt.com.
And I want to thank everybody who's been sending in the cards and making comments, and also folks that we meet who tell us that they watch the show and have questions. A couple of weeks ago, we had a question about alcoholism, and I know I answered it very quickly. I just said, well, you know, go to AA.
That was kind of a reflex answer, right? We know this works.
Yeah,
try
if you're
it.
serious, go, you know. But and then one of the things about doing this live show is we get to watch it taped, and I saw myself and I thought, well, I could have done a little better job with that.
It's more complicated.
Yeah, so here's a question, and it came in, and we'll talk some more about this. It's a 54-year-old, he drinks a case of beer a day, and he lives at home, and this is somebody's cousin. And he has no motivation to change. He paints houses once in a while, no current relationships. And the question that the cousin is making, I guess other family members, is how can we help that person?
Right. And you can't say just go to AA.
No, no, you can't. Well, I could, I guess, but I won't. Not now. Yeah. And I think that we've talked about this before. You know, why do people get motivated to change? Right. Why do they, decide to change? And it's hard to judge when somebody else is reporting somebody else's drinking and using. You know, a case of beer is a lot of beer a day. I mean, it's
he's not drinking O'Doul's, or we wouldn't be getting this question.
Yeah, and it's a lot of liquids. I mean, I'm just saying that it's almost like a drink all day. If you're doing a case of beer, you're really hitting it all day long, and I can't really make a judgment about what his life is like, living at home, living with his mother, and he's 54 years old, no relationship. And you could make guesses about that, but I don't know if that's fair, not knowing the person. But I guess if I could just answer the best I could, how can we help that person? Again, you can let him know that you have concern about his drinking and you're worried about it. But if there's no negative consequences, if there's no DWIs or nothing, and he has this relationship with his mother, as maybe they take care of each other. Maybe he sees himself taking care of his mother, or she sees herself taking care of him, providing housing. And it's really hard to judge those type of relationships. And quite frankly, it's very hard to get people to change when they're in that situation.
Yeah, I mean, because this is written from a cousin who's looking for a little bit of distance. If this had been written by the mother, for example, well, then that'll be a whole different question. But you encounter this a lot in the hospital, too, when people come in for treatment, and you couldn't really discern a great motivation for coming to treatment. They were sort of keeping the cards close to their vest. And often the situation was like this: okay, supported at home, able to use the substance you want to use, place to live, and I would say, wow, this is golden, right? Why would you want to change this situation? This seems absolutely perfect. Where's the stress here? Where's the concern? So in a way, I mean, if the whole world around this guy, and himself included, were to agree that this is a problem, then something has to be done to sort of push him off that comfortable spot.
Right.
Right now, he's probably like anyone is inert and sitting there and quite comfortable. Take a lot of energy to make some kind of movement happen. And from this question, I can't see if there's any kind of reason to want to change this situation.
Right. And the only thing that might be true, and that is I don't think people give alcoholics or people who are drinking this much. I think they have moments of what they sometimes used to call moments of clarity. Yeah. I think sometimes they can actually see what's happening to them. They know what's happening to them. They recognize it. The question may be whether or not they see a way out. Whether or not they see an opportunity. I recently had a similar call about someone like this, and I talked to the person, and as I was talking to him, he was drunk. And he was pretty defensive about his drinking, and sort of defended that he had a right to drink, and blah, 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 and he was wanting to almost argue with me, and I didn't want to argue with him. I mean,
you didn't start the phone call.
Right. You know, but he didn't call me either. I mean, it was sort of like someone else intervened and said, you know, can you talk to him? So, and I think on some level, and I don't know if this is true, it could be true of teenagers, older adults. This guy was, I guess, in his 40s. He was sort of defensive about it. In other words, he heard me coming at him like in a critical way, not in a supportive, helping way. And I have a feeling that would be true of this guy here too. As you know, when I used to, we'll talk about this later in the show, but one of the things they know that sometimes when you're trying to get people to change, if they're not ready to change, they end up defending what they're doing, their lifestyle. And so then you get into an argument of you criticizing the way they live and them saying, well, this is who I am and this is the way I live. And it really doesn't work that well. If you can somehow reflect to somebody your concerns in a supportive way and see if you can elicit from them some awareness. Now, it's hard to believe that this guy doesn't say to himself, I'm 54 years old, I have no relationships, I live with my mother, I'm drinking every day. I don't imagine he thinks that's the greatest thing in the world.
Yeah, I mean, this is not a situation that is sought in modern society, right? There are a lot of negative labels about somebody in this situation, so it's hard to imagine that he gets any kind of enforcement that this is okay.
Right, and so I would see if you can find a place that would make sense, that you can come to, or enlist it. I know sometimes if there's another adult outside the family that he might listen to, whether it be a minister or a primary care provider sometimes can be really helpful. If he's seeing a doctor can do a liver test, and you know, if he's drinking a case a day, I imagine there might be some problems, maybe not. But something medical might sort of push him off his comfort spot there. Yeah, and then you know, that motivational interviewing kind of thing and the stages of change. One of the things that it always says is, you know, if somebody's in a pre-contemplative stage, in other words, they're not even thinking about changing. They might be thinking about other things. They might visualize some other problems that they want to change. Like, what would you like? Never mind your drinking, but what else would you like in your life? What's missing would you like? And see if you can't make that connection between, in interviewing, you know, they call it developing the discrepancy. There's a discrepancy between what you would like to have and what you have. And see if you can figure out a way to get to what you want. And maybe at that point you'll question your other behaviors. Right. You know, well, you know, if I want to do this, I can't drink this much.
Yeah, and you know, it's one of the basis, the foundation of the sort of idea of motivational interviewing is that you don't come in with this conflict, and then all of a sudden, you know, they're digging into a position, you're digging into a position, and that's not a good way to start any kind of an alliance with somebody. So to be able to, in a way, instead of sort of sitting, you know, head to head and butting heads, how can you sort of sit side by side and develop a common view that you're both exploring together?
Right, and one last thing, or maybe not, but in the AA book, they have a chapter, there is a solution. It's the second chapter in the book. But the reason I mention it is that it's so important because for most alcoholics and addicts, drinking is the solution. Now they know it's a problem, but it's also a solution to life. I mean, it makes you feel good, it gives you a sense of euphoria, it quiets that critical voice. Right. And most alcoholics really can't envision a life without alcohol. And I mean, you hear about this place where they're sort of stuck between, I know I can't go on this way, and yet I can't imagine not having it in my life. Because for some, alcohol is the solution to life's problems. And I would imagine that, you know, one of the things that you'd have to realize is that you're giving somebody an alternative, a choice, which seems sort of drastic, kind of empty. Like, how would I live if I didn't drink, if I didn't have something to drink?
It's like a quantum leap to something completely different without any kind of step in between.
Yeah, and I don't think that I don't think if outsiders appreciate that, how much a person is relying. It's almost like someone who's become dependent on something, and you say, well, you don't need that anymore. And they're like, no, like, I need this. I need to keep this with me. This is how I get through my life. This is how I survive. And I heard somebody talking about working with their character defects and stuff like that. In some ways, alcohol and drugs makes it okay to live with yourself, quite frankly. I mean, it's a horrible way to live, but it sort of allows you to sort of live within the cocoon of being intoxicated, of being under the influence.
Yeah. And when you talk about that decisional balance, I mean, one way I look at it is that if it's all good and very little bad to it, so like I was saying before, his situation in some points of view might be a golden situation, and then as you start to look at what are the positives and negatives of this current situation, what are the positives and negatives of changing this situation, and eventually there comes to be some sort of almost, I won't say a tipping point, but there's sort of evenness to them. And maybe one day this situation works, 2 days it doesn't, another day it does. And that's a very uncomfortable piece, because then you're really in the grip of being uncomfortable and having to either accept the situation as it is or making some changes. And people who are comfortable don't change. So a piece of this is this guy's quite comfortable. And so how do they help to develop this discrepancy? Sort of point out to him that this balance might not necessarily be the balance, that imbalance is not what he wants right now, and try to bring that to a different position.
And also, I mean, the other thing that sometimes you'll hear has worked is that you give them phone numbers or information about treatment centers. Now, you watch it on TV, in Palm Beach or whatever, but, like a local doctor or local detox or something, and you give them those numbers, and you tell them that, while you're away, I'll take care of mom, or, while you're here, I'll do this. In other words, try to eliminate any kind of excuses or reasons why it's not possible, but it ultimately needs to be their decision to go.
Right.
I'm not a big fan of when they used to do interventions and drag the guy in.
You're leapfrogging through the process of being ready to make changes.
And they're not going to be in there that long. I mean, back in the day when we kept people for 4 weeks or 5 weeks, you could overcome those 2 weeks of I can't believe I'm here, and maybe make some progress. But nowadays, if it's just a detox, I bet you're in there 4 or 5 days, and then you go to a treatment center.
Right.
But it really needs to be more voluntary. I think that was what works best.
Because most people make changes without any kind of preventional intervention whatsoever. We see the tip of the iceberg, and that was the whole key of motivational interviewing, is to somehow interact with the person to allow them to come to the choice to make changes themselves.
Right. And last thing I'll say on this anyway, on this card, is that to recommend that family members try Al-Anon or go see a counselor or therapist, find out any suggestions they might have for local resources, whether to leave literature around or pamphlets or books or numbers for them to call, try and do it in a way that's non-critical, that is supportive and kind of understanding, but also give them enough room to sort of make it their choice, their decision, and see if that will work.
Yeah.
So, we love to get these cards and questions. It's just that we don't know enough about everything else that's going on to really say this is it.
Yeah.
But I do appreciate this.
Yeah, and maybe follow-up will tell us we were off target, and please try again.
Yeah, that's okay too.
So I can live with that.
Do you mind? One of the things that we shared this weekend was there was an article in the New York Times, and it was about a high suicidal rate in Brazil.
Right, it was a displaced indigenous population, sort of used to the primitive areas, the jungles of the Brazil.
And the land had been overtaken, and they were sort of dispossessed in some way. And they still had services. They still had state services, but they no longer had their land, their livelihood, if you will. And the article was about the high rate of suicide.
Right.
I mean, just way off the scale.
Yeah, you usually talk about suicide rates for most countries being somewhere between 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people per 10,000 people, and these folks I think were about 3 times, 4 times that rate.
And what struck me was they were all young people. And one of the great tragedies and things that make me so sad is sometimes we'll have in a community, we'll hear in the States some teenager has killed themselves, and it's sort of really. And in this story, and why I want to mention it or talk about it right now a little bit, is that what it really was about, and as far as I could read it anyway, was this loss of like a future. They really didn't know where they fit in. No, they were displaced, though they were still in their country. You know what I mean? Like they were still there. They had their family, but it was almost like they were disconnected from their past,
right?
And really not connected to any kind of future integration, if you will.
Yeah, I heard a term years ago. I was had a lot of friends from Morocco, and often the men had to go to different countries to make a living, to send money back home. And it was this French author who was writing about what we call deracination, which basically means taking away the roots, and really just the struggles. They were separated from their religion, separated from their families, separated from the sort of community norms that really sort of guides us in how we're supposed to act and carry on, and substances, illegal activities, just basically deteriorating, plus mentally and I might say spiritually as well, from this impact of being uprooted.
Right, and when you see, and we don't have to read about Brazil to know. I mean, in our own country, American Indians have a really high rate. I don't know what the suicide rate is, but I do know that they do struggle with alcoholism and drug addiction. And I believe that they were completely lost their culture, completely lost their connection to their land, or whatever way you want to think about it. Alcoholism, I suppose there was some fermentation of fruit or something, but not to the degree that we see now. I mean, introduction by the French for furs. They started trading right away. They started trading liquor for furs and gunpowder and guns. And so I go back, and as you know, my mother's from Ireland, and a lot of the Irish came over, and they left their culture, and they left the homeland, and they came here, and they worked in factories and dug ditches and whatever. But again, I think whenever you have this loss of culture, when you have a loss of homeland, when you have a loss of connection, if you will, I think you're at risk for alcoholism. I think you're at risk for suicide. I mean, alcoholism, in my mind, is sort of it's a slow way to die. You know what I mean? But it's like, I'm not living. I'm just going to be using. And I often think that that's a little bit underrated. I also think in some cases it's underrated. We don't really appreciate the price that African Americans pay when they're brought over as slaves. The complete destruction of culture, of homeland, of families. I guess I just think that we don't understand how important that is, and what an impact that has on your collective self.
It's often repeated when you were talking about with suicide. I mean, again, we can never make any predictions about individuals, but you look at sort of factors that sort of make you worry about the odds for somebody committing suicide. And two of the things that are often repeated is about depression and substance use. That most people who commit suicide are depressed. Most people will get intoxicated before they actually commit the suicide. But I think as we're talking about here, that's almost that's sort of a superficial level of it, right? That seems to be kind of the end of it. But like we've often talked about our dissatisfaction with psychiatric diagnoses, that's almost just the icing. And we're talking about something that's much deeper here. We're talking about sort of complete disconnection, which is a very sort of elemental piece of our evolution, and our genetics requires us to have these connections to our past, our future, and to each other. And when you remove these, then that's a much larger issue, a much deeper issue than simply saying, oh, they were depressed and they drank and committed suicide.
When I look at it, and again, this is outside of my field, and perhaps I should stop talking, but when you look at some of the first generations immigrants and their involvement with gangs, you know what I mean? It's they don't know how to fit in our society. They don't know where to fit in, and they fit in a gang, and they become a very strong gang culture. Now, again, this is. I obviously don't know what I'm talking about. I'm not in LA. I don't understand all that. But I can't help thinking that that's the gangs on some level give them that sense of belonging, give them that sense of this is our culture, this is a way of life, this is our tattoos, this is what we do, and that becomes really powerful.
And caring about them in a way. I mean, a lot of times working with addiction, people will talk about, well, those aren't my friends, I need to disconnect from the people I used to use with. But I think that's a little superficial, because while they might have come from broken homes, had traumatic experiences, the sort of the outlaw existence of addiction is really a sense of identity that's shared amongst people who are struggling or enjoying the addiction at whatever time they might be in. And there's a sense of identity. There's this thing called, reciprocity, where there's this give and this take. And even if it's not the most valorous type of reciprocity, who's got stuff, where can I get it, this and that. People who will sort of take care of you in some sort of fashion. And I think you see that with gangs, and in a more positive fashion. We should see that with our families, with people who are not displaced. You see that with their communities. And we need those things to be healthy. And when they're taken from us, we're going to seek them in some fashion.
Right, and I'll just say that I appreciate you talking about this with me, because we've had suicides happen while the show was on in our community, and sort of reluctant almost to talk about it on some level, not wanting to hurt anybody, quite frankly, family members who might be watching, and won't want to make any judgments about why somebody committed suicide or something. But it is something that is so worrisome, and as you said before when you were talking to me, there's really no way to prevent it sometimes. There's really, you know what I mean? Like
to predict it.
Yeah, you can talk about risk factors, and you can talk about things, but I think loss of hope, I think loss of alienation and lack of connection. And
I've heard you talk about sort of this tunnel vision that develops, that the only, I see it now, killing myself is the only solution. And oftentimes the point of, say, hospitalization or any kind of intervention is to try to get that vision to widen yet again, so you can see these things in the periphery, see people, see things, see community, and you realize, okay, maybe there is another option. And very critical, because, for example, folks who survived, say, jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge, halfway down, like, oh no, I don't want to die after all. And contrary to sort of popular folklore, people who are stopped from committing suicide don't have this intense will to continue to seek to die. Sometimes that interruption can actually be very powerful, to then have them start to develop a broader vision and to realize that there are some things in life that are worthwhile. So that stopping that movement, getting some social connection, getting some separation, reconnecting, is really critical to our wellness, but specifically in this case, where people are getting to the point of killing themselves.
Right. So again, there's no one way to identify or to prevent, if you will, or to stop it. But I just was struck by this article, reading it yesterday, and how the impact of losing one's culture, the impact of losing one's sense of ethnic, this is who we are kind of thing. And I'm glad you mentioned it. I think on some level, you lose a spiritual connection, whatever that means to people, but that sense of belonging, of being connected, having a future. To me, hope and faith are all connected, belief in the future and hope and faith in the future. And when you lose that, you almost can't see yourself going on. Like, why go on with life when it's only going to get worse, or it's not going to get better? And I think that's really where it gets dangerous.
Because we need to belong to something, to a place, a community, a spirituality, a family, a future. These are things for healthiness.
Right. And even though I've had some training in some, you feel sort of overwhelmed by the topic. I mean, really, it's sort of like, I don't know what else to do, and how to help somebody, how to prevent it. But I just thought it would be worth mentioning.
Yeah.
Okay.
That was an impressive article.
All right. The other thing that came up, and we were talking about this, and again, is that at this time of year, people make New Year resolutions.
That's right. Going to make some changes,
Got to
right?
make some changes. Things they want to do differently, whether it be exercise or losing weight, ceasing drinking. One of the things that sort of struck me was that, you know, people sort of make fun of the idea that you start off in January and then nobody is, you know, not doing it.
I mean, already people are telling me they've ditched some of their New Year's resolutions, and today's only the 5th.
That's right. Yeah. And one of the things, and again, you know, I don't know how this will work, but it's almost, and I was talking to our producer before the show about this, it's almost as if they're repeating the shoulds. It isn't so much, this is what I want to become, it's more like I should lose weight.
Somebody else says, you know, you really ought to make this change. Right?
Make this change, or I'm going to do this differently, you know, but it doesn't reach that level of when someone wakes up and they have this, like I said earlier, that moment of clarity, where they sort of say, this is not who I want to be.
Right.
I want to be a different person. I do not like who I am. And at that point, then change becomes, everything else is sort of like, well, what do I need to do to become that different person? Like, how do I go about that?
Right.
But I think a lot of times, and I don't know if this is fair, but I think sometimes I hear people echoing what they should do.
Right.
And thinking like, well, I ought to do this and I ought to do that and I'm going to do that, you know. And yet they don't change the image of who they are. They don't change the way they think they should. I just used the word should.
Yeah.
But, you know, it's kind of interesting. I think you have to decide the changes that you want to make are so that you can become a different person.
Well, we were talking about this before the show too, and not really to talk about ourselves, but I think these experiences that we had are very common experiences. You know, our families told us should, or oughta, and that sort of thing, and you know, each of us waited a little bit later to make these decisions, but there's like one is like, whoa, this really, forget what other people are saying, this isn't who I want to be. This isn't what I expect or want for myself. And that, I mean, for me, that was a very powerful moment where I said, okay, now how do I get from here to where I want to be, as opposed to where other people are telling me I should be? How do I sort of start? How did I start to take control of it and map out my own plan?
And I think that's what's so tricky sometimes for lots of people. In other words, people will make suggestions like to children or adolescents or young people. Here's what you should do this, you should do that, and it doesn't sound like it's something that. Well, that's your opinion. Like, you know, this is my life. And,
somebody said,
you know,
what do you want to do,
right?
Right?
Or even the possibilities. Like, what are the possibilities in my life? And I think, you know, I was talking about this the other day with somebody, like, he didn't really see the possibilities of life. He didn't realize, I mean, one of the things, and nobody likes this idea, but there was a time, you know, when I went into service, it changed my life.
Yeah.
You know, I went someplace different. I left my neighborhood. I left my 4 city blocks that I lived on, and you know, and I saw a different world. And I shared with you before this, you know, when I was in, you know, I was supposed to go to college, but you know, I didn't. You know, I took a different track. But the first thing I did when I got the permanent assignment in the Air Force was I signed up to go to college. You know what I mean? It was as if it was hanging in the back of my mind that, you know, here's something that I could do. But I think in some ways, and I'm going to repeat myself, there has to be a decision that this is not who I am. And again, I'm borrowing from something I read, but it was this idea that change that is superficial, that is on the surface, without a decision to change the person, or making a decision about who you are as a person.
Well, we stopped being oppositional to what other folks were telling us, and then all those different sort of spheres we belong to started to kick in, I think. And this is really who I am, this is what I need to do. It was a very eye-opening moment.
Yeah, and it was, in a way, for me anyway, it was a bit of a clean slate, you know. I mean, nobody knew me. It was a new assignment. It was a new base. You know, I had all these places I could do. It was, you know, what did I want? What of all the things that were available to me, you know, did I want to go down to the beach? Did I want to go here? What did I want to do?
And what I'm often telling people, too, is when there's there's a big gap between your current situation and where you would like to be. So your reality and your expectations, that's uncomfortable and it's too far apart. And you need to bring that together somehow. Maybe a combination of moving to achieve something as well as maybe changing your expectations enough will bring you to a place where you'd be more happy.
Or realize that your resolution, first decide who you want to be.
Yeah.
And then figure out where you want to go.
Yeah. So be nice to yourself if you happen to fall away from those resolutions.
And don't give up. Try again.
Yeah.